Hello, I'm Dennis Tucker. I want to invite you to a Bible study with me as we're going to look at Acts 17 chapter. And by the way, I preach for Lilac Road Church of Christ in Litchfield, Kentucky. If you can come be with us, Lilac Road, our building is located at 1687 Lilac Road, Litchfield, Kentucky again. Time of services on Sunday mornings, we have Bible classes at 9:30. Worship is at 10:25, and then 5 p.m. on Sunday evenings we have worship. And then Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. we have Bible class again. All of that is by Central Standard Time, by the way. And so if you can come and be with us. But I've been giving a number of lessons out of Acts 17 chapter, kind of focusing on the cities mentioned there. The first one is Thessalonica, it's mentioned to us in Acts 17, 1 through 4, specifically as far as Paul going to the synagogue of Jews there and reasoning with them from the scriptures. Then we find that persecution rises, and Paul winds up going to Berea. And Berea, we note that is a place that probably one of the best known passages out of the book of Acts in the 17th chapter, verse 11, and that they were more fair minded than those of Thessalonica, and that they searched the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so, and made a point that the scriptures don't lead us to Christ. The scriptures are going to teach us how to become a Christian. And so the scriptures are essential in obeying God. But now we want to continue on in the third city. The last lesson in Acts 17 chapter deals with Mars Hill. Paul going to Athens in Greece. And if you had a map of the travels of Paul on the second missionary journey, you'll find that up north is Philippi, up in Macedonia. And then goes from Philippi to basically Thessalonica, and then travels on down a little farther to Berea. And all these are on the coast of the Aegean Sea. And as it goes on down south, it comes to a place called Athens. Now imagine, if you would, today, that you're going to go to one of the bastions of liberalism, maybe one of the bastions of intellectualism today. You go to maybe Harvard University or University of South Carolina, Berkeley, or other places that are known for their liberalism, for their atheism, for their lack of respect for the Bible. Well, that's really what Paul's going to. And that is, Paul's going to a place that prides itself on intellectualism. And a lot of times intellectualism can come at the expense of truth, though. And so Paul's here at Mars Hill. And if you have, again, the pictures, if you have opportunity to Google Mars Hill during the time of Paul or the ruins of Mars Hill, you'll find that literally it is a hill in Athens. It's a high place there. And a lot of times, in their service to idols, they would build their temples, their altars on high places. And so this is one of the high places Paul went to. And again, Athens is a place where various men have been at and have left their mark on Greek society, Greek culture, men such as Homer, Socrates, Aristotle, and others had left their mark on Athens in their intellectualism with their wisdom. And we find what Paul discovers, what he finds when he comes to Athens. In Acts 17, verse 16, as now, while Paul waited for them at Athens, the Spirit was provoked within him when he saw the city was giving over to idols. And Paul, as he describes, and really a lot of this 17th chapter, this part here deals with things Paul had written in other letters, other places, because idolatry was widespread. And for instance, and writing to the church of Rome, in Romans, the first chapter, Paul describes the Gentiles as they gave up on God, or as they rejected the knowledge of God. And as you look in that Romans, the first chapter, you'll find a number of times Paul uses a phrase in describing these Gentiles and relationship to God. In Romans 1 and verse 24, and there it says, therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness and the lust of their flesh to dishonor their bodies among themselves. Notice there, God gave them up to do those things which are uncleanness, okay? And generally, let's talk about the idea about the sexual impurity of the people. As it goes on, verse 26, he says, for this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. For even their women exchanged their natural use for what is against nature. And then as you go on, you find verse 28 that says, and even as they denied to retain God their knowledge, God gave them over. There's not quite the same phrase, but over to a debased mind. To do those things which are not fitting. Their speculation, their imagination. God said, go ahead and just run with it. And that's exactly what they did. And Athens is an example of what happens when one rejects God and basically rejects the knowledge of God, in that man starts substituting something else in place of God. Instead of truth, when you reject truth, you start accepting falsehood. And so as it goes on in Acts the 17th chapter, we find that it talks about Paul going and start teaching, start preaching. And there's some talk about, what's this guy saying? What's he talking about? Paul, what he's doing is talking about Jesus, talking about the resurrection of Christ. But if you go down in verse 22 of Acts 17th chapter, we find that Paul sees an altar there. And let me just read that. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I perceive that all things are very religious. Now, some translations, New American Standard believes they have superstitious there. And so they were religious in nature, in a form of religion. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, and so they were worshiping various objects. He says, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, the one who you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. Now, we'll talk about the last phrase in a few minutes, but what Paul said, what Paul was seeing here was a city full of all these temples, all these altars, all these images, all these idols. And the story goes that this unknown God, and that they had those altar tools, that at one time there was an outbreak of some kind of disease here at Athens, and the people, as they were offering sacrifices to the gods, the disease kept on growing, and so they thought, well, maybe there's another God we don't know of. And so they let animals go, goats go into the city and just let them go to, and whenever they went to near an altar, they would sacrifice it to that God. But certain goats had stopped, there was an altar nearby, and so their thought process was, this must be an unknown God. We don't know who this God is. So they directed altars literally with the inscription, to the unknown God. And so Paul said, let me just kind of tell you about the true God. But what we see is idolatry that has, some would say, has gone to seed. And that's when you think about idolatry, you have to realize that all idolatry is man-made. That all of us like this unknown God, that somebody made those idols, somebody made those temples, somebody created those gods that they're going to worship. Those gods that I created themselves, they didn't exist. And so when you have this kind of religion, idolatry, what you understand is that these idols are totally worthless. All they are stone and brick or mortar or wood or some kind of metal. All they are is simply some inanimate object. Now, those idols could not come and help you in your time of need. Yeah, you could pray with them as much as you want. You could offer your sacrifices to them as much as you want. You could be as zealous as much as you want in service to that God. But that God, that idol, could not actually help you in time of need. And the reason is because he doesn't even exist. Not only that, but also that idol could not even move himself. In the Old Testament, we have examples where an idol fell over and they had to pick him up, put him standing back up. That the idol was not even able to sit himself back up. Now, the idol was moved, it was by man. That the idol did not move himself. And those idols could not even hear prayers. You could pray to this image, and I'm sure people would bow down to their images, to their idols, to this unknown God, and they may have said fervent prayers. But much like, and there's an example of this over in 1 Kings 18th chapter, when Elijah is challenging the prophets of Baal. Now keep in mind, Baal does not exist. Baal, as far as a god, it does not exist. And so as you read this passage, I'm just going to read here 1 Kings 18th chapter to get this point across. Verse 25, it says, now Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one bull for yourselves and prepare first for your many. I called the name of your God, but put no fire under it. So they took the bull which was given them, they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, Baal, oh, hear us. They're calling out to Baal, crying out to him, Baal, listen to us. But there was no voice. No one answered. Then they left about the altar which they had made. The Baal did not reply to them. And so it was, verse 27, so it was about at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, cry aloud. In other words, get louder. For he is a God. Either he is meditating, maybe he's in deep contemplation, deep meditation, can't hear you. Or he's busy, maybe he's out doing something else and you're just too busy to listen to you. Or he's on a journey, maybe he's traveled to a faraway country, he's not near you. Or perhaps he's sleeping. You just got to be, he must be awakened. Maybe he's asleep, maybe your God's asleep. And it says, so they cried aloud and cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and lances until the blood gushed out on them. Now imagine this whole scene here again. These men are zealous. They're crying out to their God. They're cutting themselves. And it says, and when midday is past, they prophesied till the time of the offering and the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. There was no God to answer them. Their image, their idols could not answer them because, again, they don't exist, really. Only in the imagination of man's mind do those gods ever exist. Because those images, those gods were simply a piece of wood or some rock or some mortar and rock or some metal. But basically, they'd be similar today. And sometimes people, have their images. They pray that image. Or it'd be similar today, maybe bowing down and praying to your stove, or bowing down and praying to your couch, or bowing down and praying some other inanimate object. That object doesn't listen to you. That object can't hear you. That object can't move itself. That object is created by man. That object cannot do anything for you as far as their salvation. It cannot listen to your prayers. And the result of idolatry is that man's religion is vain and worthless. It doesn't matter how many other people are serving this God. It doesn't matter how fervent you are in service to God. It is still a worthless religion. Jeremiah 10, verse 8, at a time that Israel was giving over to idolatry, and Judah. So, but they were altogether dull-hearted and foolish. A wooden idol is a worthless doctrine. It is worthless, literally here. We may say even worse than worthless because it leads man astray. And a lot of the immoral conduct they would read about in religion, a lot of, in the Bible, a lot of things they were doing, we read about temple prostitutes at places like Athens or Corinth or other places. Ephesus, they had these temple prostitutes and these immoral activity in the name of religion. You had talked about human sacrifices being offered in the name of religion over Jeremiah 32, verse 35. And they built the high places of Baal, which is in the valley of Sun and Hinnom, to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire to Molech. They were literally sacrificing their children on these altars to this image that does not exist, but they were justified because they're offering sacrifice to their God. Sometimes today, people may do things in the name of religion that are immoral. We are coming up to eventually here the Mardi Gras season. And a time of going out partying up on a Fat Tuesday and having a good time of Mardi Gras and just go out there and do whatever you sow your wild oats right now, because after this here you're going to have to be more stringent, more religious for a time period. And so people will do that and commit all kinds of sexual immorality. But sometimes other people will lie in the name of religion. And a lot of people do things that are wrong in the name of religion. And we have to keep in mind the rejection of God and His Word is a result of idolatry. You can either have God or you can have idols. You cannot be in fellowship both. You either going to serve the one true God or you're going to be serving an idol. Or 2 Corinthians 6 chapter. In Corinth, there's a lot of influence of idolatry among the Christians because a lot of them came out of idolatry. And so 2 Corinthians 6 chapter 14, he said, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? And what accord has Christ and Belial? And what part has a believer and the unbeliever? And what agreement has temple of God with the idols? And the answer to all those questions are none. You cannot be in fellowship with idols and God at the same time. That God Jehovah is not going to be on the list of idols that you can worship, all these idols plus Jehovah. And so they're involved in this religion of idolatry that had all these people following it. And Paul sees this here, and Paul says, let me tell you about the one true God. And so what we find in the last part of this chapter is Paul revealing to them this unknown God. They said, let me tell you about this unknown God, which is really the God we know of in the Bible. So in Acts 17, verse 23, he says, therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. God who made the world and everything in it, since the Lord of heaven and earth does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with minutes as those who need anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. And so a number of things about God we bring out about this here. So let me tell you about this God. One, he is the creator of all of us, of every blood, of every nation, every person. Everything you see about us, God is creator of all of this. Now again, that is opposition or in contrast to the idols, which had actually made nothing. What these folks do with idolatry is a lot of times their idols are very limited, and maybe the god of the sea, the god of the sky, the god of the river, the god of certain plants or animals. Their gods are very limited, and those gods they thought had dominion over that one specific little area. He said, no, this God is the creator of everything. Again, in contrast to the idols, which have made nothing. And he said, he is the Lord. He is the one that has determined the pre-appointed boundaries. In the Bible, especially a thing like Isaiah, it stresses the providence of God, the self-rule of God, that he's the one that decides what to do, that he's the one that is in control. He said, this is the God I'm going to talk to you about. He's our creator. He's the one in control. And he hears our prayers. Jesus, over in Mark 11, chapter 22 and 23. Jesus said to them, have faith in God, for surely I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be moved and be cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that those things he says will be done, he will have whatever he says. Therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe you receive them, and you will have them. And the idea is that, with prayer, God listens to our prayer. God hears our prayers. And so he is the creator. He's the one that listens to our prayers. He's the one, the giver of life. Again, that he's the one that has made man from all mankind. The one that not only made it, but in Acts 14 chapter, Paul said he's the one that has given us the seasons, the sustainer of life. And gives us seasons and food so that we have abundance of what we receive on a daily basis. And this God does not dwell in these temples you make with hands. It does not dwell at this altar with the unknown God, or in the temple of Diana, Artemis, or temple of Zeus. He doesn't dwell in these hands, these places made by men's hands. He doesn't need you to build him a temple, because he doesn't live in that temple anyway. And then he said, not only that, but also God is within reach of all of us. If you go down verse 27 of Acts 17 chapter, it says, so that they shall seek God and hope they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and have moved and have our being, as also some of our own prophets have said, for we are also his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think the divine nature like silver or gold or stone, something shaped by art of men's devising. Now, again, going back to the point that these images, they don't really represent God. They're not gods. They don't really represent God. God did not want us to make images to him. But say, again, keep in mind here that our being is testimony of God's existence. That life comes from life. And not only that, but also God tells us, he communicates to us why we're here. of our purpose in life. He's the one who gives us purpose in life. Instead of us giving purpose to our idols, God gives us purpose. Probably the best known passage in the Bible and talking about man's being and man's purpose in life is over in Ecclesiastes 12, 13, 14, where it says, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil." So God is the one that created us. God is the one that determines our boundaries. He's the one that is near us, and we are his offspring. We are a part of his creation. In other words, we are spiritual beings that God has made, and he is near to each one of us. Over in Genesis 1st chapter, 26, 27, I'm talking about the creation of man. And there it said, then God said, "Let's make man our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Now, so God made us as spiritual beings. And not only that, but also, he didn't just go far off. He says he's near us. Now, as spiritual beings, it means we are moral beings also. We have the ability to control ourselves. We have the ability to reason for ourselves. And God is knowable. And in order to know God, he has to reveal himself to us, but also we have to listen to him. Now, this kind of goes back to Romans 1st chapter, because Paul said in that chapter that the Gentiles, that they had rejected the knowledge of God. Okay, once you reject the knowledge of God, then you are left with idolatry. I said that before in this lesson. Well, we see how also, though, he said, let me explain to you who this God is. And he's God that's near to us. He's God that revealed himself to us. And he's God that gives salvation to all mankind. If you look over in Acts 17, verse 30, 31, it said, "Truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because the appointed day in which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising from the dead." This goes back to really kind of makes a circle here in Acts 17 at Mars Hill, because you go back to verse 18 and even verse 17 that Paul's teaching there, and they're kind of thinking, what's this bad word saying? What's this guy saying? And so in verse 18 of Acts 17 says, "Then certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, what does this babbler want to say?" Others say, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, gods they weren't aware of, gods they were not familiar with, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection. What he's doing is he's preaching to them not about all these idols, not about this unknown God here that they had an altar to. What he's talking about is he's talking about the known God that has revealed himself to mankind that they didn't know about. They didn't know that God, but this God has revealed himself to mankind, has sent his son to die for us. And so, you know what, folks, those days of ignorance, the days of you not knowing is over, because I'm here proclaiming to you the word of God. Over in Titus, the 2nd chapter, it said, "The grace of God that brings salvation appear to all men, teaching us that denying godliness and worldly lust, we shall live soberly, righteously, and godly in the present age." You see, the gospel of Christ is to be taught to everybody. Jesus in the Great Commission in Matthew 20 chapter said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to everyone." The gospel is intended to be taught to everybody, and everybody is told there's only one gospel. And that gospel is about Jesus Christ, the Son of God, about his coming down here, his living among men, his death, burial, resurrection, about his will being preached from that day of Pentecost onward. There is only one gospel. There is only one doctrine of Christ. And there it would be told, you need to repent and turn to Christ. You need to get out of your ignorance and turn to Christ. Now, as we end here in Acts 17 chapter, we find in verse 32 the response of the people. Paul's done his job. Paul has preached them and trying to reason with them. Now, we mentioned at Thessalonica, he went to the synagogue of Jews and reasoned them from the scriptures. At Berea, he goes to the synagogue of Jews there, and again preaches to them from the scriptures. Here at Athens, we're talking about a different type of crowd. We're talking about Gentiles. We're talking about idolaters who were not familiar with the scriptures. And so Paul talks to them about the true God. And the response is fitting as you look at this here. The response, there were some, as you look at verse 32, and say, when they heard the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, while others said, we'll hear you again this matter. So Paul departed from them. However, some men joined him and believed. Among them, Dionysus, the Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with him. I probably slaughtered that one name, by the way. But there's really three responses. And some mocked him. Some translations kind of has jeered here, made fun of him. Why? He's preaching about the resurrection of the dead. Now, one thing about the Greeks and their philosophy and their mythology is generally, a person didn't become a hero until actually died, or their gods did not come back to life. Their gods did not die to start with. Their gods would not die, but they didn't come back to life. They did. And now we have him talking about Jesus being Son of God, being resurrected from the dead. They thought, this is ridiculous. Some made fun of him. Some was procrastinated. Come back tomorrow, we'll listen to you some more. Now, Paul preached to them about Jesus. And I'm sure they could have benefited some from another lesson, but, there's not anything new to preach about Jesus except who he is, except the truth. He wasn't only given a new philosophy. And so there's some that said, come back tomorrow. There were some that believed. Some accepted what he said and followed after him, did what the gospel of Christ says. The same thing today. Some will make fun of the gospel of Christ today. They'll make fun of the Bible. They'll make fun of the idea of Jesus living, Jesus being a real person, about his death, about his resurrection, about his ascension back to heaven. They'll make fun of it. They reject it. Some folks will say, well, that's interesting, and they will procrastinate. Wait till tomorrow, wait till next year, wait till a later time. There are some that will believe and follow after. Which one? If you've been out there in Mars Hill, which one will you have done on that day? And probably the answer to that is, what are you doing today? As you hear about the gospel of Christ, are you making fun of it? Are you saying, wait till tomorrow? Are you following after it? We need to be doing what God said today. Be following his Son today. That's a lesson for us there out of Acts 17 at Mars Hill. I appreciate you watching this program. If you have the opportunity, come be with us again at Lilac Road. Our building's located at 1687 Lilac Road, Westfield, Kentucky. Sunday mornings, 9:30 Bible class. Worship is at 10:25. Sundays at 5 p.m. we have worship, and on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. we have Bible classes again. Feel free to share this video. Feel free also to hit the like button, and I appreciate you watching.